Good morning. Thank you very much. Kalimera. So, this morning, as we all know, we're continuing with the Gospel of Matthew. We're almost to the end. There are 28, 29, forgive me. I think it's 28 chapters in Matthew. And we are almost there. So maybe we can actually finish it this year, which would be great. We've been doing this over the course of the past 2 years now. Today is a difficult passage, especially for me, and I would think possibly for most of us. And those who could understand it better, God bless you. But we will do our best to try to get through it and understand it in, I guess, in a context, in a right frame of mind of what all these things mean. So, what we are reading today is found on page 64 in the Bibles. If you'd like to follow along, it may help. It should help. That's chapter 24, verses 1 to 31. So it's a big piece. I'm not covering it all, but I'm jumping around within this, let's say, bracket of pericopes this morning. Again, page 64, verses 1 to 34, and let's read through it. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And then Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For a nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famine, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'there,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See that I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the desert,' do not go out. Or 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcasses is, there are the eagles will be gathered. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So that's it. That big piece is what we will be discussing today. As I said, I will be pulling out a few of the themes, not all of them. We find about 6, and we'll be only going over about 3 of them. So, who can tell me what this is talking about? I don't think that's rhetorical. What do we think this is about? Okay. It's talking about tribulation. It's talking about destruction. It's talking about false prophets and false witnesses. Kind of sounds like Revelation in a way. So let me help you. It is known as the time of Jacob's trouble. He's talking about the end of time. What's going to happen? Christ is on his way to Jerusalem. He's there in the temple to be crucified. This is one of his last discourses in this gospel prior to his crucifixion and ultimate resurrection. So he's talking about the end of time and all the events that will take place as God completes his great plan of the ages. So let's start diving into it. So the 6, as I said, visions of the future that Christ speaks about here are first, it's going to jump. The verses are going to jump. So it's not going to be 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6. I'm going to jump around a little bit. So please, let's try to stay together. Some verses foretell the terrible days of the siege of Jerusalem by Titus, the Roman general, a siege which was one of the most difficult, most horrific in all of history. And this is verses 15 to 22, the siege of Jerusalem. Some verses tell us of the ultimate complete destruction of Jerusalem and its reduction to a heap of ruins. This we find in verses 1 and 2. Some verses paint pictures taken from the Jewish conception of the day of the Lord, verses 6 to 8 and 29 to 31. Some verses deal with the persecution which the followers of Christ, aka us and his disciples, have to endure. Us nowadays, maybe not as much as the disciples did, but still, there is that persecution. Verses 9 through 10. Some verses deal with the threats which will develop against the life and the purity of the church. These are verses 4, 5, 11 to 13, 23 to 26. And then, finally, some of these verses speak directly about the second coming of Christ. So, the 3, let's say, visions, foretellings that we'll be discussing today is, first, the siege of Jerusalem, verses 15, 22, the day of the Lord, 6 to 8, 29 to 31, and the persecution. So as I said, this is a lot. I didn't want to separate it, but hopefully next week we'll get the second half of it. And then again, the persecution, verses 9 through 10. So off to the siege of Jerusalem. It was one of the most terrible sieges in all of history, as we have said. In Daniel, the book of Daniel 12:11, it reads, "Abomination that makes desolate is set upon the temple." The Daniel reference here is very clear. About 170 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of Syria, captured Jerusalem and desecrated the temple by erecting an altar to Zeus and turned the temple chambers into brothels. It was a deliberate attempt to stamp out Judaism. So Christ here was prophesying that the same thing would happen again, and that once again the holy place would be desecrated, and as history shows us, it indeed was in the year 70 AD, the destruction of the temple again. If we go to the history of Josephus, we see how right Christ was about that terrible future. And this is Josephus writing, "Then did the famine widen its progress and devour the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying of famine. When the Romans were to come to the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses. They then stood on a horror of this sight, and went out without touching anything. Josephus himself shares in the horrors of this siege, and tells us that 97,000 approximately were taken captive and enslaved, and a little over 1,100,000 died. This is what Christ foresaw. This is what he was talking about. These are the things which he forewarned, and we must never forget that not only men, but the nations need the wisdom of Christ. Christ laid down the laws by which alone a nation can prosper, and by disregard of which it can do no other but perish miserably. So Christ is setting forth laws so that we can follow and be prosperous, yet how much of this world is not following those laws? And look at where we're winding up. Look at where the world has winded up. History repeats itself, and it is and will continue. So that's the siege. Now on to the day of the Lord, verses 6, 8, and 29 to 31. We know that an essential part of the Jewish thought of the future was the day of the Lord, that which was to come. That day was when God was going to intervene directly into history, and when the present age, with all its incurable evil, would begin to be transformed into the age to come. Naturally, the New Testament writers, to a very great extent, identified the second coming of Christ and the day of the Lord, and took the imagery which had to do with the day of the Lord and applied it to the second coming. None of these pictures that we see here, 6, 8, and 29, 31, should be taken literally. We humans tend to not think of all aspects of what's being said or being spoken about. We tend to be very close-minded. So with these alliterations, we can't take them literally. They are pictures, they are visions, they are attempts to put the indescribable into human words and to find some sort of picture for the happenings which our human language cannot possibly describe. But from all these pictures there emerge certain great truths. They tell us, one, that God has not abandoned the world. For all its wickedness, the world is still the scene in which God's purpose is being worked out. God will never abandon his world. For that reason, his purpose is still being carried out. He created it. Why would he destroy something that he created when he's created all things perfectly? Why would he abandon us, priests of creation? You and I are the priests of creation. Why would he abandon us and let us go to, let's say, into the depths of hell? Why would he allow us to do that? He won't. Secondly, they tell us that even a very crescendo of evil must not discourage us. An essential part of the Jewish picture of the day of the Lord is that a complete breakdown of our morals and apparent complete disintegration of the world must precede it. So a lot of things are to come before Christ's kingdom. But for all that, this is not to prelude the destruction. It is the prelude to recreation. We are destroying ourselves, yet recreating ourselves to better ourselves so that we may be found worthy to enter into Christ's kingdom. Sometimes the best thing, I don't know if you're writing a paper, I don't know how else to describe it, or working on some sort of project. Sometimes instead of, you're almost done, but there's something that's just missing, sometimes, I've done it, you just start from scratch, and then it works itself out. So, by that destruction of our work, of ourselves, we are recreating ourselves, hopefully better, and in that Christ-like phronima, I guess that we can say, mindset, and willful actions. Thirdly, they tell us that both judgment and a new creation are certain. They tell us that God contemplates the world both in justice and in mercy, and that God's plan is not the obliteration of the world, but the creation of a world in which is nearer to his heart's desire. Again, we're talking about destruction, yet Christ is always talking about the kingdom, that at the end of time which is to come. He never disregards his full plan. His ultimate plan is for us to live with him. He never disregards his plan. The value of these pictures is not within their details, which at best, as I said, are only symbolic and which use the only pictures which our minds can comprehend, but in the eternal truths which they conserve. And the basic truth in them is that whatever the world is like, God has not abandoned it. So now, thirdly, the persecution to come. Verses 9 and 10. 2 verses, and there's so much to talk about them. And they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. This passage, this little 2-verse pericope, shows the uncompromising honesty of Christ. He never promises his disciples that it's going to be easy. Don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of it. You just have to get in a boat and let the water take you. Let the wind take you wherever it's going to go. You don't have to row. He's not saying that. He promised them death and suffering and persecution. That's amazing. There is a scene in which a real church will always be, a sense in which a real church will always be a persecuted church. Because Christ didn't come to make life easy for us. He came so that we can have life in him. And that life in him, to get there is a struggle. But once we get to that life, then we have bliss for all eternity. There is a sense, as I said, the real church will always be persecuted so long as it exists in the world, which is not a Christian world. So the church is always going to be persecuted. We as Christians are always going to be persecuted. As we see, you turn on the TV, what's going on halfway around the world? Christians are being persecuted again. Christ offers here 4 things: a new loyalty, a new standard, a new example, and a new conscience of life. So the new loyalty, again and again, he declares that this new loyalty must surpass all earthly ties. Let go of what we hold dear to us here on earth. Lay up treasures for ourselves in heaven, not here on earth. The greatest ground of hatred in the days of the early church was the fact that Christianity split homes and families when one member decided to be for Christ and the others did not. We live this again today. How many of our marriages are interfaith marriages, inter-Christian marriages? Or how many of us have grown up and we grew up a little bit in the church, but we're forgetting it now, and our children are going to completely leave from the church? I'm not making this up. This is happening and has been happening. The Christian is one who pledges to give his life to Christ, to give the first place in his life, Christ, to put Christ first in his life. And many humans' clash is liable to results from that. We clash because we never put Christ first. We put ourselves first. Again, egotism. It's very easy to become fully, not fully, just to become full of ourselves. Very easy to do so. But is the life in Christ easy, or is it a struggle? Secondly, Christ offers a new standard. There are many customs and practices and ways of life which may be all right for the world, but which are far from being all right for the Christian. For many people, the difficulty about Christianity is that there is a judgment laid upon ourselves and upon our ways of life, in their businesses, or in our personal relationships. The awkward thing about Christianity is that anyone who does not wish to change is bound to hate and resent it. Christ calls us to change. Christ calls us to pull ourselves out of this world, to discern ourselves things that He's teaching us, His kingdom, His resurrection, and then the things by which our egos get in the way and materialism comes into our lives and rips us away from Christ. So Christ offers this new standard. Thirdly, the Christian, if he is a true Christian, introduces into the world a new example. There's really not much to say about that. We as Christians are called to be examples. And the greatest example we can see is Christ on the cross. Those in the Middle East who are being killed for their faith. They are examples. They are living examples right now. Not 100 years ago, not 1,500 years ago. Today, they are being examples. So we are to be called to be these examples. There's a daily beauty in life which makes the life of others ugly. The Christian is the light of the world, not in the sense that he criticizes and condemns it, but in the sense that he demonstrates himself, the beauty of the Christ-filled life, and therefore the ugliness of the Christian life. And finally, this is all to say that Christianity brings a new conscience of life into life. Neither the individual Christian nor the Christian church can ever know anything of a cowardly concealment or a cowardly silence. The church and the individual Christian must at all times constitute the conscience of Christianity. And it is characteristic of men, of humans, that there are many times when they would wish to silence this conscience. So we're called to be conscious Christians, not passive Christians. Conscious Christians, to struggle daily in our lives with one another, to find that joy which is in sacrificing, and not to let ourselves, as I said, go into the boat and let it take us where we wish. That's life, but we're fooling ourselves if we believe that is the true life. So, as I said, this is difficult to, let's say, possibly understand because we hear a lot about destruction. We hear a lot of bad things. You turn on the news, it's all bad. So forgive me that this is today's discussion. But out of this discussion, we need to ask ourselves a very important question. Christ is talking about the end of time, right? Are we ready for Him to come back? Are we ready to receive Him when He comes back? If we're not ready to receive Him now, what makes us think we're going to be ready to receive Him then? Are we ready for this judgment, for the end of time, the day of the Lord, as it were? Have we prepared ourselves? And tomorrow, as we know, Kathara Deftera, Clean Monday, the beginning of Great Lent, let's use this time, and we hear it over and over and over and over again, Lent, let's use this time to bring us closer to Christ. The church does its best in this fallen world to bring us to perfection. We have services throughout the week. We have more opportunities to engage Christ. Services on Wednesday, the pre-sanctified liturgy, to consume Christ, to bring Him into our lives. And then Friday nights to pray to the Mother of God that she intercedes that this world be saved in our lives along with it. So again, I leave us this morning pondering, are we ready to receive Christ? Are we ready to be judged? Let's use Lent and seriously think about that. Because we travel with Christ through the 40 days, His struggle. Why are we any better to not do that? Why should we consider ourselves better than that? If God the King came to be a servant, why should we not then be at His feet and serve everyone that He serves? It's a blessing. It's all a blessing. Thank you and good morning.
Look,